December 16, 1944, 5:30 a.m. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. General Major Fritz Bayerlein stood in his command bunker, reviewing the final preparations for Germany's surprise winter offensive. His Panzer Lehr Division, one of the Wehrmacht's elite armored formations, was positioned to spearhead the breakthrough that would split the Allied armies and turn the tide of the war. Everything was ready, the troops were in position, surprise was complete, and the weak American forces in this sector would collapse under the weight of German armor and artillery. Bayerlein had studied American capabilities thoroughly during the planning phase and had concluded that while American forces were competent, they weren't exceptional. American artillery in particular seemed adequate but unimpressive. With nothing approaching the sophistication of German fire control systems or the experience of Wehrmacht artillery officers who'd been perfecting their craft since Poland in 1939, the Americans had plenty of guns and plenty of ammunition, certainly, but they lacked the precision and coordination that characterized German artillery doctrine. Their artillery is a blunt instrument, Bayerlein had told his staff during planning sessions, effective when properly employed, but they rely on overwhelming firepower rather than surgical precision. They will fire many shells to achieve what we accomplish with fewer but better placed rounds. It's the American way, quantity over quality. His officers nodded in agreement, sharing the assessment that had become conventional wisdom throughout the Wehrmacht. American artillery was dangerous in the way that any mass firepower was dangerous, but it wasn't sophisticated, wasn't precise, and wouldn't be a decisive factor in the coming battle. German forces had faced Russian artillery barrages that made American fire seem gentle by comparison. They'd survived British artillery that was arguably more accurate, and they'd learned to function under fire through years of experience that the Americans simply didn't have. What General Major Bayerlein didn't know, what German intelligence had completely failed to understand, was that American artillery had developed a fire control technique so precise and so devastating that it could place shells from dozens of guns on a target simultaneously, creating an instant killing zone that gave no warning and offered no time to take cover. Within hours, Bayerlein would experience time-on-target fire firsthand, watching his carefully positioned forces evaporate under artillery bombardment so precise that every shell arrived at the exact same moment. And he would learn that American artillery wasn't adequate, it was the most lethal precision fire system ever deployed in warfare. This is the story of how American innovation in fire control and coordination created an artillery system that could erase entire enemy formations in seconds. How mathematical precision and communications technology transformed artillery from an area weapon into a surgical instrument. How German forces learned to fear American artillery more than they feared tanks or aircraft. And how the dismissive assessment of adequate American guns became bitter recognition that American artillery was the best in the world. The development of time-on-target fire, universally known as TOT among American artillery officers, emerged from a combination of mathematical innovation, communications technology, and the uniquely American approach to warfare that emphasized coordination and precision over individual heroics. The concept was simple in theory, but extraordinarily difficult in execution. Multiple artillery batteries, sometimes from different battalions or even different divisions, would fire at a single target with each battery's time of flight calculated so precisely that every shell would arrive at the target at exactly the same moment. The effect was devastating and psychologically shattering. Instead of artillery fire that built up gradually, giving defenders time to recognize they were being shelled and seek cover, TOT fire arrived with no warning. 1 second the target area was quiet, the next second it was being hit by dozens or hundreds of shells simultaneously. There was no time to react, no warning to take cover, just instant, overwhelming destruction from shells arriving from multiple directions at the same instant. The technique had been developed in 1943 by American artillery officers studying the problem of effective fire against prepared defensive positions. Traditional artillery preparation involved sustained bombardment that gave defenders ample warning and time to seek shelter in bunkers and dugouts. By the time infantry attacked, defenders had survived the bombardment and were ready to fight. American officers wanted something different, a way to achieve true surprise with artillery, and the solution they developed required mathematical precision that seemed impossible given the variables involved. Each artillery piece had slightly different time of flight to target depending on range, ammunition type, propellant temperature, barrel wear, and atmospheric conditions. For shells from multiple batteries to arrive simultaneously, fire control officers had to calculate the exact firing time for each gun so that despite different flight times, all shells arrived together. This required sophisticated calculations, accurate meteorological data, precise knowledge of each gun's location and characteristics, and communication systems that could coordinate firing across multiple units. The mathematics were complex enough that early attempts at QOT fire often failed, with shells arriving seconds apart rather than simultaneously, negating the element of surprise. But American artillery officers, many of them civilians with engineering or mathematics backgrounds before the war, refined the techniques and developed fire control procedures that made TOT coordination reliable and repeatable. By 1944, American artillery units could execute TOT missions with precision that amazed even the officers ordering the fire. The communications infrastructure supporting American artillery was itself revolutionary and completely underestimated by German intelligence. American artillery battalions were equipped with radio networks that allowed fire control officers to coordinate with forward observers, maneuver commanders, and other artillery units in real time. The fire direction centers, essentially mobile calculating rooms, could process targeting information and calculate firing solutions faster than any comparable system in any other army. Staff Sergeant Francis Cook, serving in a fire direction center with the 2nd Infantry Division's artillery, described the process in his post-war memoir. "We had plotting boards, slide rules, firing tables, and a team that could calculate firing data from multiple batteries targeting the same objective within minutes. The forward observer would call in coordinates. We'd calculate time of flight for each battery, transmit firing orders with precise timing, and 30 seconds later every gun would fire at the exact moment calculated to bring all shells on target simultaneously. It was mathematical precision applied to warfare, and, when it worked perfectly, the results were incredible." The German artillery system, by contrast, relied on methods that had been refined over decades but hadn't fundamentally changed since World War I. German fire control was precise and effective, but operated primarily at the battery or battalion level, with coordination between larger formations being difficult and time-consuming. The idea of synchronizing fire from multiple battalions or divisions to achieve simultaneous impact was theoretically possible but practically beyond the capabilities of German fire control and communication systems. This fundamental difference in artillery philosophy reflected broader differences between German and American approaches to warfare. German doctrine emphasized the skill and experience of individual artillery officers who could deliver accurate fire through practice, technique, and professional judgment. American doctrine emphasized systematic coordination and technological solutions that allowed even relatively inexperienced units to deliver devastating fire through standardized procedures and mathematical precision. The first major demonstration of TOT fire's effectiveness came during the fighting in Normandy in July 1944. Though German forces at the time didn't understand what had hit them, American artillery supporting the breakout from the Bocage country began employing TET fire against German strongpoints, and German defenders reported experiencing bombardments unlike anything they'd encountered before. Positions would be quiet, then would suddenly erupt in explosions without any preliminary ranging shots or buildup that would have warned of incoming fire. Oberst Heinrich Müller, commanding a Wehrmacht infantry regiment defending against American advances near Saint-Lô, filed an after-action report that reflected his confusion about American artillery tactics. Enemy artillery demonstrates unusual characteristics. Unlike Soviet or British bombardments, which begin with ranging shots and build in intensity, American fire arrives without warning, achieving maximum intensity instantly. Defensive positions receive simultaneous impacts from multiple directions, suggesting coordination between numerous enemy artillery units. Effect on troops is severe both in casualties and psychological impact. Recommend investigation of enemy fire control methods. That investigation never produced useful intelligence because German commanders fundamentally misunderstood what they were experiencing. They assumed American artillery superiority was purely quantitative, that the Americans simply had more guns and more ammunition and were using brute force rather than sophisticated technique. The idea that American fire control might be more advanced than German methods contradicted prevailing assumptions about German technical superiority and was therefore dismissed or ignored. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided the ultimate demonstration of American artillery superiority and the devastating effectiveness of TOT fire under the worst possible conditions. The German offensive caught American forces by surprise, achieved initial success, and threatened to break through to Antwerp. But as American forces recovered from the initial shock and began establishing defensive positions, American artillery became the decisive factor in stopping the German advance. The weather conditions during the Bulge were terrible for artillery operations, with heavy fog, snow, and freezing temperatures that affected everything from propellant performance to communications reliability. These conditions should have degraded American artillery effectiveness significantly, yet American gunners continued to deliver precise, devastating fire throughout the battle. The key was systematic procedure and technological infrastructure that didn't depend on ideal conditions or individual skill. It worked because the system was designed to work regardless of circumstances. General Major Bayerlein's Panzerlehr Division, which had begun the offensive with confidence in German superiority, experienced American TOT fire on the second day of the offensive while advancing toward Bastogne. Bayerlein had positioned his forces in a valley for a coordinated assault on American positions, concentrating armor and infantry for maximum impact. The concentration made tactical sense given German doctrine and had worked effectively in previous battles. What Bayerlein didn't know was that American forward observers had identified his concentration and called for a divisional top mission, coordinating fire from 3 different artillery battalions totaling 54 guns. The fire direction centers calculated firing solutions that would place shells from all 54 guns on the German position within a 1-minute time frame, with the shells timed to arrive in 3 waves, spaced 20 seconds apart to catch troops who sought cover after the first impacts. At 7:23 a.m., Bayerlein's command post received reports that all was quiet ahead, and preparations for the assault were complete. At 7:24 a.m., 18 shells from the first wave arrived simultaneously on the German position, exploding within a 2-second window that made the impacts indistinguishable from a single massive detonation. The valley erupted in fire and smoke as high-explosive shells tore through German vehicles and personnel, catching them completely exposed with no warning. 20 seconds later, the second wave arrived, 18 more shells hitting troops who'd reacted to the first volley by seeking whatever cover was available. 20 seconds after that, the final wave completed the bombardment, leaving the valley floor covered in burning vehicles, destroyed equipment, and casualties that would eventually total over 300 killed or wounded. The entire bombardment, from first shell to last, took 1 minute. Bayerlein's concentrated assault force had been effectively destroyed before it could even begin moving toward its objective. Bayerlein's after-action report, filed 2 days later, reflected shocked disbelief. Enemy artillery demonstrated capability far exceeding intelligence assessments. Concentrated formations received simultaneous fire from numerous batteries without prior ranging or registration. Effect was immediate and catastrophic, with estimated 40% casualties in less than 2 minutes. Previous assessments of American artillery as adequate but unexceptional require complete revision. Enemy fire control represents sophisticated coordination beyond our current capabilities. That assessment, while accurate, came too late to affect German tactical planning for the Bulge. Throughout the offensive, German forces attempting to concentrate for attacks found themselves targeted by TOT fire that destroyed formations before they could engage American positions. The psychological effect was as damaging as the physical casualties. German commanders became hesitant to mass forces for fear of American artillery, which meant they couldn't achieve the concentration needed for successful attacks. The artillery support for the defense of Bastogne demonstrated another aspect of American artillery superiority: the ability to maintain effective fire while surrounded and under extreme pressure. The artillery units trapped inside the Bastogne pocket continued firing throughout the siege, supporting the infantry perimeter and breaking up German attacks. Despite being surrounded, despite ammunition rationing, despite terrible weather, American guns delivered precise fire that was critical to the defense. Lieutenant Colonel Clarence Nelson, commanding an artillery battalion in Bastogne, maintained fire direction throughout the siege despite his fire direction center being in a basement under constant bombardment. His unit fired over 10,000 rounds during the week-long siege, many and carefully coordinated top missions that caught German forces approaching the American perimeter. Nelson's post-siege report noted that even with ammunition restrictions, his battalion never failed to deliver fire when requested because the fire control system allowed them to maximize the effect of every round. The German forces attacking Bastogne, accustomed to Soviet artillery that fired massive barrages with limited accuracy and British artillery that was precise but methodical, found American artillery to be something different entirely. It combined the best characteristics of both, delivering massive volumes of fire with precision that made every shell count. German attack formations would assemble in woods or dead ground, believing they were concealed, only to receive TOT fire that caught them perfectly positioned for maximum casualties. Hauptmann Otto Rimmer, commanding a battalion attacking Bastogne from the north, described the experience in his diary. We cannot mass for attacks without immediately receiving concentrated enemy artillery fire. Their observers must see everything. Their fire control must be instant because the shells arrive before we can react or disperse. Lost an entire company this morning to artillery that seemed to come from every direction at once, all shells arriving in the same moment. The men are terrified of American artillery, more than they fear tanks or aircraft, because at least you can see tanks and aircraft coming. The technical sophistication of American artillery extended beyond just the TOT technique to encompass the entire fire support system. American artillery employed variable time fuses, a proximity fuse technology that detonated shells at optimal height above ground for maximum fragmentation effect. German forces in open positions found that American shells would airburst above them, raining shrapnel down on troops who would have been protected from ground-burst shells by terrain. The VT fuse, one of World War II's most closely guarded secrets, turned every American artillery shell into an airburst weapon that was devastatingly effective against personnel in the open. German soldiers learned quickly that taking cover in foxholes or trenches offered little protection against American artillery because the shells would detonate above them and fragments would fall into positions that would have been safe from traditional artillery. The psychological effect was crushing. There was nowhere to hide from American artillery. The coordination between American artillery and maneuver forces was another area where American doctrine proved superior to German practices. American infantry and armor commanders could request artillery support through a system that delivered fire within minutes of the request, often using TOT techniques, to achieve maximum effect. The speed and precision of American fire support meant that American maneuver units could operate more aggressively, knowing that devastating artillery support was always available on short notice. German forces, by contrast, had to coordinate artillery support through more cumbersome procedures that often resulted in delays between requesting fire and receiving it. German artillery was skilled and effective, but the system for integrating artillery with maneuver units was less flexible and responsive than the American system. This meant German infantry and armor often couldn't count on immediate artillery support when encountering unexpected resistance, while American forces routinely called in fire missions that arrived within minutes. The scale of American artillery operations in the European theater was staggering and itself contributed to the system's effectiveness. The U.S. Army in Europe operated roughly 10,000 artillery pieces of various calibers, from 105mm howitzers to 8-inch guns to massive 240mm howitzers that could destroy fortified positions from miles away. This vast arsenal was coordinated through communications networks and fire control systems that allowed concentration of fire from multiple units on single targets. The ammunition expenditure rates tell the story of American artillery's operational tempo. During the Battle of the Bulge alone, American artillery fired over 2 million rounds, an average of over 50,000 rounds per day for the 6-week battle. Some individual batteries fired over 1,000 rounds in a single day, maintaining rates of fire that German artillery couldn't match due to ammunition shortages and logistics limitations. The American logistical system that kept this volume of fire supplied was itself a revolution in military operations. The German response to American artillery superiority was largely ineffective because it addressed symptoms rather than the fundamental systemic advantages. German forces attempted to disperse more, avoiding concentrations that made attractive artillery targets. This helped reduce casualties but also reduced offensive capability because German attacks required concentration to achieve local superiority. German artillery attempted to suppress American guns through counter-battery fire, but American counter-battery fire, often using radar to locate German gun positions, made this tactic suicidal for German artillery. The introduction of counter-battery radar to American artillery units in 1944 created another asymmetry that German forces couldn't overcome. American radar could detect enemy artillery fire, calculate the location of enemy guns, and direct counter-battery fire within minutes of detecting enemy shells. German artillery that fired on American positions found themselves receiving precise return fire that forced them to displace or be destroyed. This meant German artillery became increasingly reluctant to fire, knowing that shooting revealed their position and invited devastating response. Sergeant Robert Palmer, operating a counter-battery radar with the 7th Corps Artillery, described the system's effectiveness. "We'd pick up German shells on radar as they were in flight, calculate the firing position, pass coordinates to our guns, and they'd have fire on the way before the German shells even landed. The Germans learned fast that firing at us meant getting hit back immediately and accurately. After a while, German artillery barely fired at all because they knew what would happen. We owned the battlefield because we controlled the artillery. The statistics on artillery effectiveness demonstrate the dominance American artillery achieved. Post-war analyses estimated that American artillery caused 60 to 70% of German casualties in the European theater, a higher percentage than any other weapon system including rifles, machine guns, tanks, or aircraft. This casualty-causing effectiveness, combined with the psychological impact of sudden, precise bombardments, made American artillery the most feared aspect of Allied military power from the German perspective. The training system that produced American artillery crews deserves recognition as a critical factor in the system's success. American artillery schools trained forward observers, fire direction personnel, and gun crews to standardize procedures that ensured consistent performance regardless of individual unit quality. A newly arrived artillery battalion could integrate into the fire control network and deliver effective top fire within days of arriving in theater because the procedures were standardized and the training was thorough. German artillery training, while producing skilled individual gunners and officers, didn't emphasize the systematic coordination and standardized procedures that characterized the American system. German artillery effectiveness depended more on the skill and experience of individual battery commanders and fire direction officers, which meant quality varied significantly between units and declined as experienced personnel were killed or wounded. American artillery effectiveness remained consistent because it relied on system and procedure rather than individual skill. The evolution of American artillery doctrine during the war reflected the unique American approach to military problems. Identify the challenge, develop systematic solutions, test and refine procedures, train personnel to standard methods, and execute with precision. This approach produced an artillery system that was greater than the sum of its parts, where individual guns and crews that were merely adequate became devastatingly effective when integrated into the coordinated fire control network. The final offensives into Germany in 1945 saw American artillery operating with near-total superiority. German resistance was sporadic and fragmented. German artillery was largely silent due to ammunition shortages and fear of counter-battery fire, and American guns could fire without interference. The Rhine crossings, the Ruhr pocket, the drive to the Elbe, all were supported by artillery that could mass fires of hundreds of guns on single targets, delivering top bombardments that obliterated German strongpoints in seconds. The German military's post-war assessment of American capabilities consistently rated American artillery as the most effective and feared Allied weapon system. German officers who'd fought on both Eastern and Western fronts often stated that American artillery was more dangerous than Soviet artillery, despite the Soviets having numerical superiority. Because American fire was more precise, better coordinated, and delivered with timing that gave no opportunity to seek cover. General Lothar Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's most accomplished armored warfare commanders, wrote in his memoirs, "American artillery demonstrated technical and procedural sophistication that exceeded German capabilities. Their ability to concentrate fire from numerous batteries on a single target with split-second timing represented a revolution in fire support. We had nothing comparable and no effective counter. American artillery made concentration of forces suicidal and dispersion ineffective, creating tactical dilemmas we could not resolve. The human dimension of artillery warfare is often overlooked because artillery kills at a distance, without the direct confrontation of infantry combat or the drama of tank battles. But the men who served in American artillery units, from forward observers calling fire while under enemy fire themselves, to fire direction center personnel calculating firing solutions in basements and bunkers, to gun crews loading and firing in all weather conditions, were as critical to Allied victory as the more visible combat arms. The forward observers in particular faced extraordinary danger, operating ahead of friendly lines to identify targets and adjust fire. Many were killed or wounded while calling in artillery strikes, staying in exposed positions to ensure accurate fire even as enemy forces closed in. Their willingness to remain in danger to deliver effective fire was critical to the artillery system's success and represented courage equal to any infantry assault. The cultural impact of American artillery superiority extended beyond the immediate tactical effects to influence German strategic decision-making. German commanders planning operations had to account for American artillery dominance, which constrained their options and forced defensive postures that surrendered initiative to Allied forces. The knowledge that concentrating forces invited devastating artillery fire meant German forces often couldn't achieve the mass needed for successful counterattacks. The post-war development of American artillery doctrine built directly on the World War II experience with TOT fire and coordinated fire control. Modern American artillery, with digital fire control computers and GPS-guided ammunition, executes the same fundamental mission with greater speed and precision. But the basic concept of massing precise fires from multiple units remains unchanged from 1944. The revolution in artillery warfare achieved by American forces during World War II established principles that remain relevant 8 decades later. At the Field Artillery Museum at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, displays explain the development and employment of tot fire during World War II. The exhibits include period fire control equipment, plotting boards, firing tables, and communications gear that enabled the coordination required for successful tot missions. The museum's description emphasizes that American artillery superiority came not from superior guns. German artillery pieces were often technically better, but from superior fire control, coordination, and integration with maneuver forces. The German generals who dismissed American artillery as adequate learned through bitter experience that adequate guns employed with superior coordination and precision were far more effective than superior guns employed with conventional methods. The mathematical precision of TOT fire, the communications infrastructure supporting rapid coordination, the logistics system delivering millions of rounds of ammunition, and the training system producing competent crews combined to create an artillery force that dominated the battlefield, despite not having the longest-range guns or the largest caliber shells. The transformation of German attitudes toward American artillery from dismissive contempt to genuine fear took less than 6 months of sustained combat. Early war assessments that emphasized American quantitative advantages while downplaying technical sophistication gave way to recognition that American artillery represented a fundamental advance in fire support doctrine that German forces couldn't match or counter effectively. The toll of American artillery on German forces was both physical and psychological. Hundreds of thousands of casualties from the direct effects of shells. An immeasurable degradation of combat effectiveness from the psychological impact of sudden, precise bombardments that gave no warning and offered no shelter. German veterans consistently described American artillery as more terrifying than Soviet artillery, British artillery, or any other threat they faced. Because American fire came with the precision and timing that made survival feel like random chance rather than skill or caution. The artillery that German generals had dismissed as adequate became the artillery that German soldiers feared above all other weapons. The fire control system that seemed merely workmanlike became the most sophisticated precision strike system in the world. The TOT technique that represented American mathematical precision applied to warfare became the gold standard for artillery employment that other nations tried to emulate. General Major Bayerlein, who'd confidently assessed American artillery as a blunt instrument before the Bulge, filed his final report on artillery effectiveness in February 1945 as his shattered division retreated toward Germany. The assessment was starkly different from his pre-war analysis. American artillery represents the most lethal and effective weapon system encountered in this war. Their fire control achieves coordination and precision that exceeds German capabilities. Their ability to concentrate fire from numerous batteries with split-second timing creates instant killing zones that cannot be survived or countered. Previous assessments of American artillery as quantitatively superior but qualitatively adequate were catastrophically wrong. American artillery is qualitatively superior in every aspect that matters: coordination, precision, response time, and integration with maneuver forces. That reassessment, buried in German military archives and rediscovered decades later, captured the complete reversal of German perceptions. The adequate artillery had proven to be the best artillery. The blunt instrument had proven to be a surgical tool. The force that was supposed to be overcome through German tactical skill and superior equipment had instead overcome German forces through systematic excellence that German methods couldn't match. The shells that arrived simultaneously from dozens of guns, giving no warning and offering no escape, erased entire battalions in 60 seconds, just as the technique's name promised. Time on target wasn't just a fire control method, it was a revolution in artillery warfare that shifted the balance of power decisively toward forces that could execute it, and only the Americans could execute it with the consistency and precision that made it devastatingly effective. The German generals learned too late that dismissing American capabilities as adequate was a fatal error. Adequate American artillery, when coordinated through superior fire control and employed by well-trained crews with unlimited ammunition, became the most effective artillery force in history. The guns that weren't supposed to be impressive themselves into German military consciousness as the weapon system to fear above all others. The mathematics that enabled TOT fire, the communications that coordinated us, the training that standardized it, and the logistics that sustained it, combined to create artillery superiority that German forces couldn't overcome. The shells arrived together every time, erasing targets and synchronized detonations that represented precision warfare before the term existed. Game over. The adequate artillery won.